Picture this. You're sitting in the break room at work. Your coworker takes a bowl of soup out of the microwave and, hey, it looks like a pretty tasty tomato soup. It smells pretty good too. But they sit down and they bring the spoon to their lips and they slowly slurp the soup. Your arm hair stands on edge and you shudder. You immediately feel annoyed. You think to yourself, why can't they just put the spoon in their mouth and eat like a normal person? Your coworker puckers and smacks her lips, takes a drink and swallows so loudly, and then they clear their throat. You're sitting there, amazed that this person appears to have no table manners, and then they take another slurp of soup. Your heart rate increases, you feel your muscles become tense, and it feels like the blood is rushing to your head. Now you feel angry, and your coworker is oblivious as they keep slurping their soup. Okay. Let's picture another scenario. You're heading into the campus library to study for a final exam. You find a quiet spot in a secluded area of the library, you unpack your books and you start to read. But then the hum of the fluorescent lights above you starts to feel so loud. How is anyone supposed to study here with that infuriating hum? You hear someone nearby turn the page of a paper. Another person clicks their pen a few times. You close your eyes, you try to refocus so you can get back to studying, but now your mind is pulling a blank. All you can hear is the hum of the light, the sound of someone turning a page, always catching your attention. And by God, you just want to grab that pen and throw it down the hallway. If you're listening, you might think that my description of this scenario is me being overly dramatic. Other people listening might feel heard, perhaps for the first time in their life, and recognize that, hey, this happens to me. Well, if that's the case, I have news for you. What I just described were examples of misophonia. Misophonia is a condition where specific sounds trigger a negative emotional reaction, oftentimes like anger, frustration, irritation, or they trigger a reaction in the body like goosebumps, muscles tightening in your chest, a sudden jerking reaction, tightness in your shoulders, increased heart rate, and rapid breathing. Certain sounds might even lead you to want to take action, like feeling like you have to leave the room or that you need to plug your ears. The thing about misophonia, though, is that these reactions happen after hearing very specific sounds. Sounds that other people usually have no problem with. For example, the mouth or throat sounds like swallowing, slurping, coughing, or lip smacking. These are often triggers for the reactions in misophonia. Even things that aren't body-related can be triggering, like cutlery scraping on a plate, the electric hum of something, clicking or typing, or even the cry of a baby. Well, for that last one, the cry of a baby might irritate everyone. If you hear it on a plane, you just want to get some sleep, it's an 8-hour flight, and the baby's not stopping crying. But in misophonia, this reaction is disproportionate to the situation. It's a 0 to 100. It's immediate, and it happens every time that sound is heard. It's an extreme reaction, like being very angry, being super irritated as soon as the sound starts. So while most of us don't like the sound of a crying baby, the reaction in misophonia happens fast. It's felt in the body very intensely, and the emotions are much bigger than they would be of a person without misophonia. So, hi everybody. I'm Troy Boucher. I'm a PhD student in the clinical psychology program at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia. I first became interested in misophonia when I was working with someone who told me that they became unreasonably irritated at the sound of green beans rubbing against a plate. I was fascinated. What was the cause of this reaction? Was it something related to this person's hearing system? Something related to how sounds are processed? Maybe both? And why green beans? What about carrots or broccoli? Do these make him feel unreasonably irritated as well? Needless to say, my interest was piqued. And now I hope your interest is too. So now that you're interested, my goal is to answer those questions that I just asked in order to get an understanding of misophonia. What is the cause of misophonia? What happens in the auditory system? And what happens in our brain? Why do very specific sounds cause negative reactions, while other sounds don't? Let's get into it. The first thing we need to talk about is how we normally sense and process sounds. Sensing sounds involves a basic way that sound waves enter our ear. All sounds produce sound waves, and different sounds are going to produce different waveforms. It's a job of our ear to take those sound waves and send this information to our brain. Our brain then processes that information. The brain gets sent this info about the different sound waves, and then the different areas in our brain are working together to make sense of that basic sensory information. Processing happens when our brain makes sense of basic information coming in, like different areas of our brain are telling us that a piano is playing. Sure, we needed those sound waves to enter our ear to get passed along to our brain, but it's our brain that's telling us that, hey, that's a piano. It's coming from over there. This song is canon in D. Oh, this piano sounds a little flat. Maybe it needs to be tuned. And, oh, I like this song, but when it's played on a tuned piano. But before it gets there, the sound waves have to first enter our outer ear, and that's where they get funneled into the ear canal and into the eardrum. These sound waves that come into our ear are going to vibrate the eardrum, kind of like how a drum is going to vibrate if you hit it with a stick. So this eardrum is what separates the outer ear from the middle ear. The vibrations of the eardrum are sent to little bones in our middle ear called ossicles. These ossicles dance around according to the vibrations that it receives, and after it does its little dance, it's going to send that information to the inner ear. These messages get passed to the cochlea, which is a tube that's shaped like a snail. Along this twisting snail are little hairs that pick up these signals. The hair at the front is going to pick up the higher pitched sounds, and the hair at the back is going to pick up those lower pitched sounds. These hairs in the cochlea then send this information to the brain via the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve connects our ear to our brainstem. Our brainstem controls the essential functions of our body like breathing, heartbeat, basic reflexes like blinking. But the brainstem is also used to relay messages that it receives from inside and outside of the body, and it sends those messages to different parts of the brain. For example, the brainstem receives sensory information from our senses like our eyes, from our skin, our tongue, our nose, and, of course, our ears. And the brainstem then shoots that information off to different parts of the body, and then to different parts of the brain to make sense of all of this information. So to summarize, sound waves enter our ear. Those waves get transmitted through to the inner ear and to the auditory nerve, which then sends those signals to the brainstem. The brainstem then sends it to other parts of the body, if it needs to, or to parts of the brain to piece together and make sense of things. In misophonia, it's thought that there isn't actually anything different with this sensory system up until sound reaches a brainstem. Up until this point, when it reaches a brainstem, someone with misophonia takes in sound very similarly to how people without misophonia take in sound. In contrast to misophonia, tinnitus is a problem that happens when the cochlea or auditory nerve get damaged. Tinnitus is like hearing a constant ringing when there isn't actually anything ringing around us in our environment. This might happen if you are exposed to loud sounds. Like injuries to the inner ear in tinnitus might be why your ears are ringing after you go to a concert, or why, if you've worked with heavy machinery your whole life, you end up hearing ringing in your ears when it's quiet or you're trying to go to sleep. But in misophonia, the process of sound coming into the ear, then being sent to the brainstem, isn't actually different from people without misophonia. That means that in misophonia, there's got to be something different about how the sound is being processed. This means that, starting with the brainstem, the reactions we see in misophonia are the result of how the various regions of the brain are responding to this input after it's getting sent to the brain from the auditory nerve. The processing of sounds in our brain involves many different areas of our brain working together to make sense of the input. The auditory cortex is a part of our brain that's considered the main processing center for sound. It helps by analyzing the pitch, the volume, and the location of sounds in space around us. Because the auditory cortex is the main processing center for sound information, it's going to send signals to other areas of our brain when it's done doing its processing. But before I can get to this auditory cortex, it's first sent from the auditory nerve to the brainstem. Let's think of sound processing like a mailroom in a big company building downtown. Let's say we drop off a letter in a mailbox. which is like how sound enters the ear. The letter gets carried to a central mailroom where it needs to be sorted and then routed to the appropriate department inside the building. The sound gets dropped off in our ears, and then the auditory nerve takes it to the brainstem before it gets sent to the auditory cortex. The brainstem is like the manager of the mailroom. They decide what mail they're just going to send to the main processing center, which is the auditory cortex, and what mail they're going to send directly to parts of our body, like an express delivery. That's because not every piece of mail is equally important. Let's say I have a note from the receptionist that really needs to get to the CEO. Excuse me, sir, your card just exploded. That piece of mail is going to be prioritized and sent very quickly to where it has to go. My prioritized letter is given directly to the mailroom manager, who takes a quick look at it, oh my gosh, and delivers it straight to the CEO. Important sounds like a sudden crash cause a sudden reflex by the mailroom manager, the brainstem, to act very quickly without the need for more in-depth processing that happens in the auditory cortex and other areas of the brain. Our brainstem is connected to the systems in our body that are responsible for automatic and unconscious action, meaning that when the brainstem gets certain types of information from our senses, it's going to tell the body to act automatically, like the way you jump when a balloon gets popped behind you. But the brainstem still passes along the information to the auditory cortex. So we still have this sudden reflex in our body, like our motor system that makes us jump, and that's being directed by the brainstem. But we also have the brainstem passing that sound information to higher brain regions for further processing. Some sounds are just better at catching our attention, like loud sounds and new sounds. Those are seen as important. Our brains also prioritize sounds that are personally relevant to us. For example, if I go to a deli and I pull a ticket that says I'm number 46, I'm going to have my attention captured when someone in the deli says 46, because that's my number, and I want a sandwich. But if I'm walking my dog and I hear someone say 46, that number probably doesn't mean anything to me in that situation, so that sound isn't given priority. Priority is also given to sounds that are necessary for our survival, like a scream or a gunshot. If someone is screaming or shooting a gun, there's a potential for our life to be in danger, so that information is prioritized by our brainstem and then sent post-haste to the auditory cortex, ASAP. So in our mailroom analogy, sounds that are necessary for our survival are sent to the correct departments by our mailroom manager with the goal of keeping us alive, like activating our fight or flight system. The fight or flight system is a body's built-in survival mechanism. It's a way our body prepares to either confront a threat head-on or try to make an escape. After a threat is perceived, you get a rush of hormones like adrenaline. Adrenaline prepares your body to fight or to get away by making the body do a few things. Our heart rate increases to pump more blood to our muscles, and then the blood gets pumped to our vital organs like our brain and our heart. Your breathing rate increases so you can get more oxygen, and it feels like your focus becomes narrow, like tunnel vision, so that you can concentrate on the threat. Fear isn't the only emotion that activates our fight or flight response. Anger is another big emotion that signals our fight or flight response. Remember that anger is one of the big emotions in misophonia, and fear isn't. Fear is related to something called phonophobia. Phonophobia is a fear of specific sounds, and the activation of the fight or flight system in phonophobia happens because of the fear of a specific sound. Now, there might be overlap in the types of sounds that activate the threat response, like a honking of a car or a siren, but the difference is that in phonophobia, the primary feature is fear, and in misophonia, the primary feature is anger or disgust or irritability. In misophonia, the brainstem is a bit hypersensitive. It's telling our body to react to sounds that might otherwise be passed along without issue to the auditory cortex. So instead of just reacting to the life-threatening sounds of a scream or explosion, the brainstem activates a sudden reflexive response to mundane sounds, like someone slurping ramen noodles or the hum of a fluorescent light. But how does our brain learn what is and isn't a threat? Well, that's where the limbic system comes into play. The limbic system has brain structures like the amygdala, which processes emotions, and the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. We can picture the amygdala and hippocampus as workers in the limbic system department. The amygdala is the emotion worker. It has a job of checking the emotional importance of sounds, and when the amygdala gets a sound like a scream or a gunshot, it might attach a label of scary or fearful or maybe even like angry to the sound. The emotion worker, the amygdala, is also connected to our fight or flight system that's used to keep us alive because things are being labeled as a threat. The hippocampus is a memory worker, It has a job of organizing sounds and storing the important ones based on how emotionally significant it was. The hippocampus also looks back into the old files, the old memories, and it pulls out the information from our experiences before to help label that sound with an emotion alongside the amygdala. In misophonia, the amygdala, or that emotion worker, it's a bit overactive. He's very alert, he's super sensitive, so he's going to react strongly to some sounds that he gets, even if they're just normal everyday sounds like swallowing or clicking. In misophonia, the hippocampus, or the memory worker, is very efficient at processing the sensitive reactions of the amygdala. When someone with misophonia hears a trigger sound, the hippocampus quickly files it in his cabinet that says, hey, this sound was a pretty big deal. Let's make sure to feel a strong emotion the next time this happens too. Because the amygdala is connected to our fight or flight system, the specific and triggering sounds heard by people with misophonia are often activating the fight or flight system because it's being labeled as a threat, even though there isn't any real danger. This then leads to the release of things like adrenaline and our bodies preparing to protect ourselves, and the brain thinks there's going to be a fight, and our attention becomes focused on the triggering sound. The connections in our brain that respond to sound become more sensitive, and they change with more and more experiences when they become activated. This means that more exposure to these triggering sounds in misophonia, the more sensitive the system becomes at activating and perceiving it as a threat. The basal ganglia, the amygdala, the hippocampus, they're all learning that this sound is being associated with a threat, that it's bad, and that it requires a response. It's a feedback loop. So, to recap how the brain is processing the triggering sounds in misophonia, let's go through an example. Slurping soup isn't something that activates our fight or flight system from birth. But when the person with misophonia lives their life and has this oversensitive brainstem that treats some mundane everyday sounds like a potential threat, this is going to get signaled to the amygdala and hippocampus, and the fight or flight system becomes activated. And the brain remembers that this specific sound caused all these big feelings and emotions. So even though it was just slurping, it's treated as if it's a threat that needs some immediate response. This means that the person is a lot more likely to have a negative reaction to slurping sounds in the future. I hope that helps explain why our brains process sounds this way and how this processing happens in misophonia compared to people without misophonia. If you're like me, you might still have some questions. Why slurping of all of the possible sounds? Why clicking? Why tapping? Why fluorescent lights? Why the sound of green beans rubbing against a plate? Let's explore one possible reason. It's something called associative learning. One type of associative learning is called classical conditioning. The most famous case of classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov, who trained his dog that ringing a bell meant that it was time for dinner. The dog, naturally, before this experiment, would salivate when presented with food. Then Pavlov started showing his dog the food and then also ringing the bell. Eventually, Pavlov could ring a bell, and the dog would come and he'd start salivating, even when there was no food around, because the dog associated the bell with food. For misophonia, people aren't drooling when they hear a triggering sound, but there's an association formed between that triggering sound and the way they feel in their body and in their emotions. Classical conditioning leads to an automatic and involuntary response, which means that we're not choosing to have this reaction happen to us. This learning is happening outside of our conscious awareness, and that means it's something we're not even aware of is happening. It means that the person could have heard that specific sound when their sensitive emotional system was already activated in a way that made them feel irritated or angry. And then those emotions became paired with the sound they just heard, because our brain is really good at making connections between the thing we just heard and the way we're feeling right now. For example, I'm making my fake son, Troy Jr., eat some vegetables. He hates broccoli, he hates cauliflower, and he hates the taste of green beans. The parts of his brain that I talked about before are more sensitive than other people. His brainstem is more active and it does less filtering of mundane sounds, so it's prepared to activate a reflex when there's something that he hears that's maybe a little unpleasant. Then Troy Jr. rubs the green bean across a plate, and the brainstem didn't like that. The brainstem didn't filter that one out. Instead, it actually says, whoa, that is weird, and I do not like that. And that might lead to a startle reflex like shuddering or jumping, or on a more extreme end, that dumping of adrenaline in fight or flight. The brainstem filters that on to the auditory cortex afterwards, and then to the limbic system, where the amygdala labels that sound as bad because the brainstem didn't like it, and it's caused a startle response. So the hippocampus files away to say, remember that sound made you jump, and you did not like that. So when Troy Jr. is presented with green beans again at dinner next time, they rub on his plate and it makes the same sound. He has the same reaction, that same startle, the same processing in the brain that says, this sound is no good, it is bad, we hate this sound, and we hate that it made us jump. Troy Jr. doesn't realize in these early experiences that this sound is causing that reaction within him. But as time goes on, this reaction becomes stronger, and the association between the triggering sound and the reaction of, this is bad, and his anger and his heart rate increasing and his breathing rate increasing and annoyance, all of those reactions become stronger. So it's not that there's something special about green beans rubbing against a plate specifically. What I mean here is that there's not something about green beans that makes them uniquely able to cause this associative learning. The magic isn't in the beans. It could have been other sounds, like a knife and fork scratching against a plate. Could have been Troy Jr.'s little brother gargling his milk at the dinner table. It's more about how the person's brain and their sound processing system is sensitive and ready to activate. It's how the brainstem is sensitive and letting more mundane sounds in, then causing this reaction. And this reaction becomes paired with that sound, so they quickly learn to dislike that sound. But Troy, you might ask, wouldn't this sensitive emotion and sound processing system mean that people with misophonia have the potential to have several different sensitivities to several different sounds? Didn't you say that misophonia was specific sounds? You said it could have been green beans or scraping or gargling. Well, you're right, and I'm right too. There's sensitivity for many different sounds in people with misophonia. Research suggests that adults with misophonia have an average of 10 sounds that cause a similar negative reaction. These sounds all tend to be similar such as all being mouth sounds or related to eating, or being mechanical in nature. And as people get older, this number of triggers and the severity of their negative reaction, those increase. This could still potentially be due to associative learning. The conditioned response of anger and irritation starts to happen when the person hears similar sounds to the first one. Sounds that are similar in pitch, similar in volume, have similar sound waves. If the anger and negative reaction started with chewing, then the physical and emotional response becomes triggered over time by sounds like chewing, but also sounds like slurping, swallowing, coughing, clearing a throat, things that sound like chewing, and to things that happen alongside chewing. So no, it wasn't just green beans rubbing against a plate that caused a reaction in the person I talked about. Green beans rubbing against a plate did cause the biggest reaction in that person, but he also hated the sound of styrofoam and packing peanuts squeaking against each other. He hated the squeaking of cloth or wipers on windows, and he hated the sounds of squeaking on balloons. These sounds have similar properties, so his brain learned that sounds like squeaking of green beans, that should also receive a reaction too. That's why it's green beans against a plate and not broccoli or carrots. Broccoli and carrots don't make the same sound as green beans when you rub them against a plate. Go ahead, try it at home. But if you rub two balloons together, oh boy, that sounds a bit like a green bean being rubbed against a plate. That's how people with misophonia obtain these negative reactions to specific sounds, while other sounds tend to be fine and can be heard without any issue. Ooh, that was a lot of information. But I hope that this exploration in misophonia has shed some light onto this unique condition, especially if you've never heard about it before. By looking into how sound is typically processed and how it's processed in misophonia, we gain a deeper understanding of how certain sounds can trigger the intense emotional responses that we see in misophonia. We also talked today about how these sounds become associated with certain emotional responses and how these reactions might be triggered by similar sounds over time through associative learning. As we continue to understand more about misophonia, there's hope that this understanding will lead to a better way to help deal with those sounds and the challenges with this condition. Until next time.